Lecture number 7, Post-Colonialism in Africa. So what is the colonial legacy in Africa? Well, the effects of European rule continue to plague the African continent. Many Africans today embrace anti-colonialism or resentment for the European legacy in Africa, justifiably so in most cases. Hatred for European ethnocentrism is evident across the continent today. Many European countries found themselves in precarious political and economic situations once the Europeans left. Traditional economies were disrupted, traditional family life was disrupted, uncertain political systems were established, and unstable governments often emerged. With the European departure and subsequent independence, many African nations found themselves confronting a grim new reality: ethnic conflict. For although Pan-Africanism and the negritude movements helped to inspire nationalism and eliminate European rule, the European departure will be followed by violence erupting between opposing ethnic groups in many places, whose ancient rivalries became present again following the European departure. This will result in civil wars and bloodshed, and even genocide in some places. We will see this happen in a nation called Rwanda, where ancient rivalries between the Hutu and Tutsi tribes will result in a genocide in 1994. We will be watching a documentary about this event called Ghosts of Rwanda. Colonial powers did leave behind infrastructures in some African nations. However, many African nations had virtually no framework under which to maintain social and political order. This will lead to much weakness and instability in many of these places. All right, so there have been many steps towards development in Africa. We've already learned about how many African nations gained their independence following World War II, but especially during the 1950s and 60s in Africa. We've learned about the Pan-Africanism movement and negritude movements led by nationalists like Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal. We've already discovered that other nationalists like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana used peaceful methods to gain independence. We've also learned about Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. However, we also know that certain groups were not peaceful in their resistance movements. An example of this is from our last lecture, which included the Mau Mau group in Kenya, and they used armed resistance and terrorism. Other groups in places like Angola and Mozambique actively resisted European rule using guerrilla warfare. Well, one by one, African nations made their way towards independence. Many of these nations are called developing nations today. What does this mean? Well, developing nations are those nations that are still trying to modernize and industrialize. Generally speaking, when we refer to the developed world, we're speaking of nations that have already undergone an industrial revolution or have modernized. This modernization generally allows the nation to focus on social issues because they are developed enough to do so, and they have a modern infrastructure and foundation. Well, developed nations during the Cold War were often called First World or Second World nations. Modern nations that aligned themselves with the U.S. during the Cold War, especially those in Western Europe, were called First World countries. Industrialized nations that aligned themselves with the Soviet Union during the Cold War were referred to as Second World nations. They included many countries in Eastern Europe and reflected the division in Europe referred to as the Iron Curtain. Well, during the Cold War period, countries that were still undergoing industrialization, or those nations that had yet to modernize, were referred to as Third World countries. Today, these Third World nations are also called developing nations. So during the Cold War, many of these Third World countries were located in Africa. They became pawns in the U.S. and Soviets' Cold War, often forced to take sides in exchange for economic development and support. Well, we know the Cold War has been over now for over 25 years, but the term Third World nation has still stuck. Many nations in Africa are still Third World or developing nations today. Developing nations face many challenges, regardless of their geographic location in the world. And there are two main challenges facing these nations today. First, political problems. Building national unity is really hard in many of these places. Why? Well, there's still a struggle between traditional village life and the modern concept of national governments telling people what to do. Life in traditional communities is based on the village structure and local leaders. This is still a concept that some African cultures struggle to overcome. Secondly, economic issues. A huge challenge for most African nations today is economic stability. Many nations in Africa have undergone civil wars as a result of this type of instability. One example of this happening was in Congo, where rival provinces fought for control. In Congo, a dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko emerged. He controlled Congo from 1965 to 1997 and spent much of the nation's money on himself. A civil war began again between rival forces once he was forced out of power in 1997, and we still see civil war there today. Other nations that experienced civil wars included Ethiopia and Somalia. In the 1980s, a horrible famine struck these nations due to drought. Ever hear the song "We Are the World" from the 1980s? Yeah, well, many celebrities got together to raise money to assist these people during the famine and stop the violence.
There comes a time when we heed a certain call, when the world must come together as one. There are people dying. Oh, when it's time to lend a hand to life, the greatest gift of all. We can't go on pretending day by day that somewhere will soon make a change. We all a part of God's great big family, and the truth, you know, love is all we need. We are the children. We are the ones who make a brighter day. So let's start giving. There's a choice we're making.
We're also going to learn about another nation that experienced a civil war in the 1990s, Rwanda. This civil war is going to lead to genocide in 1994. Countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia have also been affected by civil war. In addition to civil warfare, many newly independent African nations have struggled with maintaining stable government systems. Some African nations chose one-party rule. What is this? One-party rule is when a single political party maintains control over a nation. Generally speaking, it results in a single leader assuming power. This happened in Tanzania, where a leader named Julius Nyerere assumed power. One-party rule actually came naturally to those nations where consensus was practiced in villages. One political party was established to show unity amongst all people. Well, in places like Tanzania, where Julius Nyerere came into power, you're going to start to see this one-party rule. Julius Nyerere argued that this led to democracy because people could vote for different choices within the same political party, but it's one-party rule.
Idi Amin was a brutal dictator, one of the worst of the last 100 years.
Idi Amin Dada was born in Kiboko, Uganda, and joined the British colonial army in 1946. As part of the King's African Rifles, he served as an assistant cook who proved himself to be an ambitious soldier.
While he was part of the British colonial army, he started to develop a very bad reputation as somebody who would torture people during interrogations. People who were supposed to be arrested would suddenly end up dead. The British nonetheless kept promoting him.
As a close associate of Prime Minister and President Milton Obote, Amin rose to the rank of Major General and led an attack on the King of Buganda in 1966.
There were stories that the Buganda were arming themselves to oppose the government of Prime Minister Obote. Reluctantly, Obote decided that those Buganda that were arming themselves should be disarmed, and he sent Amin to do that. But when Amin got there, he used excessive force that resulted in hundreds of people dead, property destroyed, and the king fled into exile.
After relations with Prime Minister Obote soured, Amin staged a relatively bloodless coup on January 25, 1971, and took power over Uganda.
Idi Amin staged his coup against Milton Obote when Milton Obote went to attend the Commonwealth Heads of State conference in Singapore. At first, he didn't kill many Obote loyalists, but in 1972, the year after the coup, people were literally massacred.
After establishing military rule in Uganda, Amin demonstrated eccentric and ruthless behavior.
Idi Amin tried to give himself these sophisticated titles, His Excellency, President for Life, Dr. Al-Haji Idi Amin, King of all the beasts on the earth and the fishes in the sea, and liberator from the British Empire of all of Africa and Uganda in particular. And that's not just a sentence, that was his title.
Amin ordered massive massacres, motivated by ethnic, political, and financial factors, and created a death toll estimated by Amnesty International at 500,000.
The people of Uganda coined the name Aminism. People were arrested, people were tortured, people were killed. It was a terrible period, unprecedented in the history of Uganda.
In 1976, Amin offered safe haven in Entebbe to the Palestinian hijackers of Air France Flight 139. After many of the hostages were rescued and flown home via Kenya, Amin retaliated by killing hundreds of Kenyans living in Uganda.
Idi Amin's reaction to the Entebbe raid was to become even more vicious. He killed Dora Bloch, who was one of the passengers on the plane. He then killed many of the supporters, or presumed supporters, of Milton Obote.
Amin invaded Tanzania in 1978, but the Tanzanian army overthrew his government, forcing him to flee to Libya. After accepting asylum and living freely in Saudi Arabia, Idi Amin died of kidney failure on August 16, 2003.
However, some African nations have turned to military rule. The military will take over the government and sometimes oust or get rid of corrupt leaders in such situations. Under military rule, political leaders emerge from the military, usually in the form of well-known generals or commanders. In addition to military rule, some African nations have attempted to undergo democratization, meaning they have attempted to establish democracies. Some nations, formerly run by brutal dictators, like Uganda, have tried to democratize. Other nations that have democratized include Côte d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, as well as Senegal. Many nations in Africa are still considered developing nations, as I've said before. Much of this is because of their economic instability. In order to combat instability, many nations in Africa have attempted to experiment with various economic systems. We've already learned about the 4 main economic systems in the world, so write these down for review. There are traditional economies, free market or capitalist economies. There are socialist, also called command economies, as well as what we have, mixed economies. Under purely socialist or command economies, the government makes important economic decisions for the people. Many African nations have experimented with this type of economy with varying degrees of success. We've already learned that the most extreme type of socialism is called communism, remember? Well, not all socialist economic systems are communist. There are so many different ways to implement these systems. Some nations, as we have learned, are more socialist than others. Well, in African nations that have experimented with socialist practices include Tanzania under Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, and who also experimented this was from Ghana during the 1950s and 60s. Most African nations today have mixed economies. Most nations have tried to build their economies using multinational companies. These are businesses that are present with branches in many different nations. By working closely with other branches in other African and European nations, African nations seek to build up their economies by working together in order to compete with other nations. However, this has often resulted in continued influence in Africa by European countries who often control these multinational corporations or companies. Many African nations are still dependent upon their former colonizers, in other words, Europe. A main component of this is economic dependence through cash crops. Many nations in Africa are still highly dependent on these crops. Many European nations control the prices of these crops, and very often African nations are not given fair prices for these. This has spurred many efforts in Europe and the U.S. to help countries that are dependent on cash crops to receive fair wages and prices in order to level the playing field. Many African nations are in debt today, which means that they owe a lot of money to banks in places like Europe. These developing nations use almost all of their resources to pay back this debt and are only paying interest usually on the debt. This results in them always staying poor and never being able to get out of debt. In a way, this can be called economic imperialism. African nations are still indebted to the same nations that controlled them before independence. Some politicians and celebrities are trying to change this and encourage nations to forgive these nations of their debts. As a result of economic and political problems in developing nations of Africa, there's also another crisis underway, a population explosion. Since the 1950s and 1960s, there has been a population explosion across Africa, where traditionally people have always had larger families. Some nations have an out-of-control population rate. However, in some places, the population rate is actually decreasing because of healthcare initiatives like family planning. Modern healthcare is helping to reduce not only family size, it's actually helping people live a bit longer. So we're seeing population rates decreasing in some places, whereas in other places, because medical care has rapidly improved, we're seeing a population explosion. So the rate has also decreased in some places because of a high AIDS epidemic. However, AIDS population, or Africa's population, is expected to double by 2050. As of 2000, there were 800 million people living in Africa. This population increase puts a strain on social and economic systems across the continent for programs like education and healthcare. Namely, how will they provide these things for their people? Thanks for listening. Bye.